Is there any popular musician as prolific and consistent as Bruce Springsteen? From the bare emotive tracks about life in New Jersey to the working class anthems and iconic stadium rock hits, the boss's career has been nothing short of legendary. He's the first musician in history to score a top 5 album across 6 consecutive decades. He sold over 140 million records worldwide and has earned 20 Grammy Awards, 2 Golden Globes, an Academy Award, a Tony Award, and even the Presidential Medal of Freedom. When I got into Springsteen recently, I had one very overwhelming thought. Holy shit, that's a lot of music. With 21 studio albums under his belt, it can be quite daunting knowing where to start, and I thought, why not do a list of what I personally think are his worst to best albums? We're just going to be talking about his 21 studio albums here, so anyone expecting to see Tracks or The Promise, I apologize, but they're not here. So join me on this journey through the discography of one of the world's most beloved and famous musicians. This is Bruce Springsteen, worst to best. 2009's Working on the Dream is the final part of a trilogy of albums that Bruce made with producer Brendan O'Brien, but sadly it doesn't come even slightly close to being as strong as those previous 2 records. Featuring much of Springsteen's all-time worst material, this album switches between being bland and flat-out awful. O'Brien's production on the first 2 albums in the trilogy has been widely criticised, and I think it's at its worst here. Everything sounds so lifeless and crushed. Springsteen's love of 60s rock music is seen throughout, with a lot of Beach Boys and Beatles-esque moments. There's a lot of wall of sound production and girl group backing vocals, but unfortunately the songwriting is so uninteresting that it all feels so unfocused. Songs such as Outlaw Pete and Good Eye rank among probably his worst and most obnoxious songs to date. Unlike any of the other albums that he made with the E Street Band, this is the one that feels most singularly guided by Bruce's vision and Bruce's vision alone. Everything made with the E Street Band sounds so grand in scope, so captivating and open, but nothing here really feels like that, which again wouldn't be a huge problem if the songwriting was strong enough to keep it interesting. Unlike the rest of Springsteen's discography, this is one of the only albums that I don't think has a really great standout track. There are definitely songs I like on there. This Life and Life Itself are both solid tracks, but nothing else here stands out, and when it does, it's not for a good reason. You know it's bad when by far the best track on the album is the bonus track, The Wrestler, which wasn't even released on the original version of the album. 2014's High Hopes is a bit of an oddity in Springsteen's discography. The album was made during the tour for Wrecking Ball and is a collection of covers, outtakes, and reimagined versions of older songs. Bruce described the music as some of our best unreleased material from the past decade, and there are definitely some strong moments throughout. American Skin, 41 Shots, a fan favourite live song, shows off Bruce's strong knack for writing powerful, politically charged anthems. There's a fantastic rock version of The Ghost of Tom Joad, which is a duet between Bruce and Tom Morello, who played guitar on many of the tracks on the album, and there are a few other moments here and there that feel very immediate and tender, but so much of it just lacks the punch and excitement that you expect from him. It's quite a messy and thrown together record that features some of Bruce's weakest lyrics. It's overly long and fairly forgettable. Despite its good moments, there's not enough here to justify giving the whole record a listen unless you're a completionist. On March 31st, 1992, Springsteen released 2 studio albums, Human Touch and Lucky Town. 2 albums that were released at a very odd time in Springsteen's career. The E Street Band had broken up and Springsteen had moved to LA, where he started working with session musicians. Human Touch started production in 1989 and kept being delayed, shelved, and then reworked. The final album is a collection of uninteresting, dull, soft rock songs. It's almost an hour long of quite middling middling, slow and forgettable songs that all sound the same and don't really go anywhere. The performances from the session musicians are obviously well done, but they also feel quite lifeless and lacking heart, something that I'm not sure any album apart from Lucky Town has been guilty of. It's very radio friendly, lacking any bite or edge, lacking any excitement. It's completely unimaginative and throwaway. It almost has the opposite problem of Working on a Dream, where there's a lot of strong songwriting here, but the music sounds so uninspired and lackluster. But this album isn't completely doom and gloom. There are actually a few really solid moments here. Springsteen described the album as consisting of mostly love songs, and there are some really great ones. The title track, despite encapsulating everything sound-wise I find dull about the album, is actually quite a strong and sweet track. And Roll of the Dice is classic Springsteen at his best, to the point where its inclusion kind of comes out of nowhere. And I even like 57 Channels and Nothing On, despite his reputation as one of his worst. This is far from a terrible album, but it's just so middle of the road. I just want to say now that from this point onwards, I like every one of these albums. So if you're upset that I've ranked your favourite album so low and assume that means I don't like it, that is not the case. Springsteen just has so many good albums that unfortunately some really strong ones have ended up fairly low. 2022's Only the Strong Survive is Springsteen wanting to make an album where, by his own words, he sang and tried to do justice to the great American songbook of the 60s and 70s. It's a collection of R&B and soul covers, and because of that it's kind of hard to talk about. There are covers of songs by Commodores, Frankie Valli, Four Tops, The Temptations, Benny King and others. Springsteen sounds like he is having an absolute blast here, and that is certainly infectious. The album is basically just him doing karaoke, as he doesn't do anything to reinvent material, but the album is filled with passion and love. The performances and production are all very crisp and clean. Considering he was 73 when he made this album, his voice sounds incredible. This is a completely inessential album in his discography, but to be honest, he can do whatever he wants to at this point. He's been making albums for 51 years. As long as he's having fun, more power to him. I've only put this album where I have because it's just not really for me. It's a good record, but I would rather listen to the original songs. Lucky Town came about when Springsteen, intending to record just one more song for Human Touch, accidentally made 10. While many consider this to just basically be another Human Touch, I personally think this album is far superior. It does still have the issue of the music lacking personality and heart, but not only is the songwriting far superior, but the style of the album fits far better with Springsteen's style. Clocking in at 39 minutes compared to Human Touch's 58, this is a far more to the point and consistent record. Tackling more of an Americana roots rock sound, the album is far more personal and emotional. Springsteen tackles struggling with his success, the strife in his personal life, as well as the Gulf War. While the album is a little bit inconsistent and at times underproduced, it does feature a lot of Springsteen's best material. Better Days, Local Hero, and If I Should Fall Behind are all great, and the title track is probably a top 5 Springsteen song for me. While I wouldn't completely defend this album, and I do think it has its flaws, I do think it's one that gets a little bit too much flack and deserves a re-evaluation. I'm sure this album being as low on the list as it is will turn a lot of heads. 1995's The Ghost of Tom Joad was considered by many to be a big return to form. The album was Springsteen's first folk record since 1982's Nebraska and definitely shares a lot of similarities to it. The first time I listened to this album, I really didn't get it. I found it a bit dull and overly long, but after a couple of re-listens and after paying closer attention to the lyrics, I definitely have far more appreciation for this record now. That being said, I do think I might appreciate this record more than I actually enjoy it. The music is very somber and minimal, which definitely fits well with the harsh and stark lyrics. Taking influence from John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, the album is a heartbreaking depiction of the plight of the poor in America. Bruce sings incredibly specific and desolate stories about Mexican immigrants and Vietnamese refugees. Springsteen's storytelling is great, although sometimes can be a little bit too literal. The music is probably probably my biggest issue with the album, and it does suffer from being a little samey at points, but his strong lyricism and Springsteen's delicate, softly sung vocal performances really do help it stand out in his discography. While I don't think it's the best of his folk material, I do think it's a strong entry into his discography, despite having one of the ugliest album covers I've ever seen. 2020's Letter to You was the first new album with the E Street Band in 6 years, following the death of Springsteen's former bandmate George Feist. The album was written over a week and a half and recorded live in the studio over 4 days with very few overdubs. Bruce sings about regret, aging and dying in a very powerful and emotive way. The songs are profound, beautiful and at times life-affirming. At points the album almost comes off as a swan song to Springsteen's career. It feels very definitive and musically has returned to the classic sound of albums like Born to Run and The River. While for me the album can be a little bit inconsistent at points, when it's at its best it contains some real all-time classics. The title track and Ghosts are both strong standouts and 2 favourites of mine. The whole record feels like a celebration of life through the power of music and is a massive love letter to the fans. It would have been very easy for Springsteen to make a reflective, nostalgic album looking back at life, but he doesn't do that at all here. He simply reflects on the beauty of what they have and how the past has gotten them there. The music, songwriting and performances are all earnest and bold. This is one of Springsteen's warmest, sweetest and most sincere records to date. A real joyful celebration and an elegy on life and death and everything in between. While it's not a favourite of mine, it is one I can see sticking with me and only resonating with me more as I get older.
If I'd been a rich man's son, pay me my money down, I'd sit on the river and watch.
We Shall Overcome, the Seager Sessions from 2006, is yet another covers album, his first one in fact. The album consists of 13 folk songs made popular by folk musician Pete Seeger. I originally had this album quite a bit higher on the list, but I felt it almost disrespectful of the other 13 albums. There's not much to this album, but it is a hell of a lot of fun. It's an incredibly joyous, vibrant and bouncy record. It has a real classic traditional Americana folk vibe that is just so enjoyable and rambunctious. Springsteen tackles a lot of really famous material on here like Old Dan Tucker, Jesse James, and he also did Buffalo Gals as a bonus track. The performances are all really great and Bruce sings each lyric with such sincerity and joy. This is not going to be an album for everyone, but if it sounds like even slightly your thing, I would recommend it.
Filled with devils and us.
2005's Devil and Dust is Springsteen's third acoustic album and in my opinion one of his most overlooked. Much of the material on the album had existed for over a decade, with much of the album being recorded as far back as 1996. Supposedly the album only came about because Springsteen had recorded a bunch of acoustic songs over the years and realised he had a full album's worth of material. That would make you think that the album feels like a bunch of separate songs thrown together, but it's incredibly cohesive and striking. Similar to Tom Joad, this album is more than Springsteen with an acoustic guitar and does feature a full backing band. Songs like All the Way Home show this off perfectly, and while there's a plucky acoustic guitar and country-esque slide guitar, it's a rock song first and foremost. Bruce's vocal performance is a little bit odd in places, and occasionally he is basically just doing a Bob Dylan impression, but he manages to sell it for the most part, and it helps make it feel a little bit more original compared to his other acoustic albums. The title track and Long Time Coming are quite possibly my favourite folk songs he's ever written, are 2 that I constantly return to. While the song quality can be a little bit inconsistent occasionally, for the most part this is a really strong record. It's intimate, emotional and constantly beautiful.
Lonesome day.
2002's The Rising stands as one of the landmark albums of Springsteen's career. Following a 7-year break, the longest break between albums of his whole career, this was considered a real return to form. The album marks the first album to feature the E Street Band in 18 years following a highly successful reunion tour, and is also the first of the previously mentioned trilogy produced by Brendan O'Brien. The album was written in the aftermath of 9/11 and is largely a collection of reflections following these events, but But despite that, this is not a heavy and depressing album by any means. This is just as upbeat, vibrant, and powerful as you would expect. Musically, it's a return to the classic Springsteen sound of the 70s and early 80s, but updated for a modern age. There are influences from Middle Eastern music as well as hip-hop in points. While O'Brien's production can be a little bit too compressed and crushed for how large and open the music is, it thankfully rarely takes too much away. In fact, there are some moments where this actually adds to the record and gives it a far more urgent and personable feel than anything we've heard before. This album feels truly like Springsteen completely reinvigorated, using the power of grandiose rock and roll to heal and mend following a tragedy. Lonesome Day, Mary's Place, the title track, and My City of Ruins are some of Springsteen's all-time great songs. The biggest thing that's holding the album back is a bloated runtime and a few too many filler tracks, but despite that, this is still a great record and manages to be the rare reunion record that is almost as good as the old material. 2007's Magic is the second album in the Brendan O'Brien trilogy, and in my opinion the best. The E Street Band are back following Devils and Dust and We Shall Overcome, and help to deliver some of the punchiest and most exciting material that Springsteen has made this century. The album is filled with frustration and disillusionment with the state of American society. Springsteen is angry, and much of the album features some of the heaviest and rockiest material of his career. The opening track, Radio Nowhere, is borderline hard rock led by heavily distorted guitars and a huge anthemic chorus. It's probably in my top 3 favourite Springsteen songs and is one I've listened to pretty much daily for months. More so than The Rising, this album sounds like a classic Springsteen album with modern production. You could completely see this album coming out after Born to Run. It's filled with everything you'd expect from that classic formula, but what makes it so great is that it manages to avoid just feeling like a nostalgic rehash. The songwriting is absolutely top form, and the band perform with so much joy and passion. Living in the Future is a stone cold classic with huge saxophones, explosive organs, a strong groove, and a vocal performance from Springsteen that sounds like he hasn't aged a day. O'Brien's production may be the only real drawback for me, as some of the songs quite honestly are a little hard to listen to, but thankfully Bruce and the E Street Band are at the top of their game.
We take care of our own. We take care of our own.
2012's Wrecking Ball really resonated with me in a way that not much of Springsteen's post-Born in the USA material has. An angry protest album against corporate greed and corruption. After writing about people in tough economic times for years, Springsteen wanted to write an album about the people who brought America to this ugly point. It's Springsteen at his most biting, confrontational, and commanding, but he does so with a musical blend of his classic heartland rock sound mixed with the Americana style of the Seager Sessions. It's a real bombastic, fiery record filled with poignancy and ambition. This is one of the most exciting records of Springsteen's recent career because he's filled with so much vigor throughout. At points it can be a little bit over the top and almost goofy, but I kind of like that about it. It's such a huge record played with the most sincere passion. There's a lot of experimentation with modern music throughout, which helps the album feel much more current. There are samples throughout and even a rap feature at one point. The incredible Death to My Hometown is based around Celtic rhythms and is a borderline folk punk song. This album also contains a studio recording of fan favourite Land of Hope and Dreams, which is my favourite song that Springsteen has ever written. It's a song filled with hope for change, which is so beautiful and powerful. Springsteen's lyrics are incredible and his performance is one of his most emotional. The song contains a beautiful posthumous saxophone solo from Clarence Clements, sampled from a live performance of the song before his death, and it's such a powerful moment that gets me choked up every time. It would have been the perfect closing track, but for some reason Springsteen put in a song called We Are Alive, which kind of sounds like a song from the Chicken Run score. It's really weird. Released almost 40 years after his debut, this album is a true testament to just how timeless Springsteen's message is. Nothing changes. People will always need a voice like the one he presents. Greetings from Asbury Park, New Jersey is Springsteen's debut album from 1973. While much of his identity is here, you can tell this is Bruce still discovering himself, and in some ways that's what I think makes this album so great. Springsteen's Bob Dylan influence is shown heavily throughout, especially in the lyrical department. Songs are overloaded with lyrics, and some with such urgency and passion that he manages to somehow sell every single word. The opening track, Blinded by the Light, is incredibly word heavy, but is full of vivid imagery and wit. While not entirely a folk album, these songs feel almost like folk songs that have been arranged for a rock band. There's still a heavy emphasis on the acoustic guitar and vocals, however, which I think helps show off just how great of a songwriter Springsteen is. His musings on working man life are exactly what would go on to define him as an artist, and you can see that all throughout a song with strong importance and passion. Throughout the album, you get this strong sense that Bruce thought he would never get to make another album, so wanted to chuck everything he had at it. It's emotional, it's funny, and it's filled with some of the greatest songs ever written. While he still hasn't found his sound yet, there is a strong charm to this record that I find so infectious. I will always have a soft spot for this album, as it completely converted me from a Springsteen hater to a Springsteen fanboy.
Everything dies, maybe that's a fact. And maybe everything that dies someday.
1982's Nebraska was Springsteen's first acoustic folk record. The story is that Springsteen recorded a bunch of acoustic demos on a 4-track recorder with the intention of re-recording them with the E Street Band. After recording with the band, Springsteen and producer John Landau realized that some songs just didn't fit the full band sound. Much of the full band songs that were recorded were either scrapped or used for Born in the USA, and Springsteen instead released Nebraska, which contained 10 of the acoustic songs. The fact that this album was released by a major label is nothing short of extraordinary. Due to the nature of the recording, the album sounds quite rough, with much of the instruments having a warbly tape effect going on throughout. The album is essentially a lo-fi collection of songs recorded as a demo, but that only adds to the beauty of it. This album is solemn, heartbreaking, and incredibly challenging. The lyrics are often bleak and dark, but Springsteen weaves feelings of redemption throughout in a really beautiful way. It's a harrowing, deep, and completely singular chapter in Springsteen's discography. While Tom Joad tried to recapture this album's feel, it didn't even come slightly close. This album is a true marvel, a rare achievement that was achieved completely accidentally.
Hello, sunshine, won't you stay?
2019's Western Stars was a real surprise for me. Inspired by the music of artists such as Glenn Campbell and Burt Bacharach, this is a country pop record. It's essentially a collection of songs that sound like they were written in the 70s. Just listening to the description, I did not expect to really gel with this album, but it is just incredible. It's a return to its earlier style of character-driven songs, focusing on American themes of isolation and community. It's very majestic in scale and enchanting. Springsteen essentially becomes a crooner on this album and makes the transition perfectly. The songs are sophisticated and poignant, but could only be performed by someone in their late 60s who's lived a full life. The album is very warm and beautiful, but at points it can be heartbreaking and sad. Bruce does a great job of conjuring up images of the American West through the stories he presents through the album. The heavily acoustic orchestral sound of the record really helps sell this older sound. Despite being a 2019 record, it sounds like it was plucked from 40 years prior and just cleaned up a little bit. Springsteen's voice works perfectly with the songs, and he sings them with so much passion and emotion. He sells every line in such an elegant way. It's completely unlike anything else in Springsteen's discography, and because of that, it's not one I would recommend to people looking to get more into him or people who haven't heard anything by him. But if you are a big fan, or even if you're not a fan of anything he's done, it is one that is worth a listen. Springsteen's second album, The Wild, The Innocent and The E Street Shuffle, was released exactly 11 months after his debut. What a flex to put your first two albums out within the same year and for them to both be great. It somehow sounds like Springsteen finding his identity and recognizable sound, but it also sounds like him experimenting and making the weirdest music of his career. The album feels like a real love letter to rock and roll music fused with the soul and R&B that would base only the strong survive. The album is a display of suburban society sung with affection and nostalgia. It's a very musically diverse album, but Springsteen doesn't miss a beat. Its huge, cinematic and vivid exploration of Jersey life is wild yet beautiful. Springsteen really starts to come into his own here with his romanticized songwriting and diverse exploration of musical sounds. Some of his most iconic and memorable songs are on here, such as the E Street Shuffle, 4th of July, Asbury Park, Sandy, and Rosalita Come Out Tonight, all of which are among my favourites by him. This is one that doesn't seem to rank very high on other people's lists, but I personally think it's one of his best.
In this tunnel of love.
Tunnel of Love is essentially what Human Touch could have been if the songs were stronger and more members of the E Street Band showed up every once in a while. Following up his biggest album, Born in the USA, this record is much more low-key, darker and more introspective. While the very spacious, synth-heavy production makes the album quite a product of its time, Springsteen's songwriting is just on top form here. Far more personal and autobiographical than ever, much of the album seems to explore Bruce in the most tumultuous time of his life. There is a feeling of dissatisfaction and emptiness throughout much of the lyrics on this record, but at the same time this is basically an album about love, about the highs and lows of commitment, without ever romanticizing anything. Its honesty can be at times heartbreaking, at times funny, and at times beautiful. Musically, the album is essentially a late 80s pop record, but the production, songwriting and incredible performances really help solidify this album as one of his classic releases. Tougher Than the Rest, Tunnel of Love and One Step Up are among some of my favourite songs by him. It's a fun yet emotionally charged record, one that I imagine will only get better the more I listen to it. Following Springsteen's breakthrough album Born to Run, 1978's Darkness on the Edge of Town was a little bit controversial upon its release. The album sonically takes the sound and style that Springsteen innovated on that record, but presents it in a darker and more philosophical light, something that many upon its release were mixed on. However, it would go on to be considered one of his best for those exact same reasons. Taking influence from punk rock and country, the album is grittier than anything Springsteen had written before, while still having that huge anthemic sound and fierceness. The record is filled with heavily distorted guitars and vocal performances so passionate that at points Bruce is borderline screaming. But songs like Something in the Night and Racing in the Street are much more somber and melancholic. The record is one of the most mature and powerful of his earlier material and would become a catalyst for records such as Nebraska and Tom Joad. Badlands, Candy's Room, The Promised Land and the title track are all among the best songs Springsteen has ever written, and those songs alone lead me back to this record regularly.
It's like us, baby, we were born to run.
1975's Born to Run was Springsteen's breakthrough album and is still to this day one of his signature releases. Similar to his sophomore record, the album takes influence from rock and roll and R&B, but adds this huge anthemic quality. Springsteen's writing is some of his best, tying less into his Jersey Shore roots like his first two records and into more of a middle America demographic. It perfectly captures the zeitgeist of American youth during the mid-70s, tackling war and working class struggles. Much of the record focuses on characters feeling trapped and grounded, trying to break out and fight back. It's heavily driven by this passionate, desperate longing to run and move forward. Springsteen considers this to be the record where he created his own world and a series of characters whom all others for the rest of his career would refer back to or resonate off of. The songwriting is powerful, explosive, and highly emotionally captivating. Following Phil Spector's Wall of Sound production production style, the record sounds huge and in your face. Every single song stops you in your tracks. Bruce manages to take all the classic rock and roll tropes and add such a heavy realism to them. Songs like Thunder Road and the title track are perfect encapsulations of what makes Bruce such a singular songwriter and rank among the best songs ever written. This is the record where Springsteen completely finds his distinct sound and perfects it. Every single one of its 8 tracks are an absolute masterpiece and never fail to move me. 1980's The River is an absolute juggernaut of a record. Springsteen's first and to date only double album, unless you want to count Human Touch and Lucky Town as one. The album feels like a real celebration of everything Springsteen does best. During its massive 82-minute runtime, Springsteen and the E Street Band combined some of their most upbeat and at times silly songs with some of the most emotional, introspective and beautiful songs they've ever written. Attempting to capture the live sound of the E Street Band, the record is much livelier and garage band feeling than any of his previous records. The album almost feels like a new wave record at points, with Springsteen's heavy emphasis on these big pop songs. It's essentially a party record, but it never lacks the immediacy and emotional potency of Springsteen's other works. In fact, much of the material on here is some of the most emotive and beautiful music he's ever made. The title track, one of Springsteen's best, almost foreshadows the haunting and bare sound of Nebraska, and Point Blank is one of Springsteen's most painful, dealing with the disappointments of working class family life. One of the things I love about this album is that you have songs like those, and you also have songs like Sherry Darling and You Can Look But You Better Not Touch, which don't remotely take themselves seriously. But Springsteen's incredible songwriting, the band's pitch-perfect performances, and the album's fantastic sequencing help it all come together without ever feeling out of place or crowded. The record is one of Springsteen's most important. It's the perfect halfway point between Born to Run and Born in the USA, and is one of the most integral albums in American rock and roll history.
You can't start a fire. You can't start a fire without a spark.
1984's Born in the USA is one of the best-selling albums of all time and regularly places quite high on greatest albums of all time lists. So I'd love to come in and be controversial and put this like right at the bottom of the list, but I just can't. This album is up there for a very, very good reason. Expanding on the pop stylings of The River, this record perfectly encapsulates Springsteen and the E Street Band at the absolute height of their career. Exploring his usual themes of working class struggles and disillusionment, the album's bitterness and anger towards Reagan-era America feels like a true call to arms. It's protest music presented as pop music, which somehow makes it even more effective and infectious. Using the power of music, Springsteen presents us with a strong political stance and a bombastic sense of attitude. Much of the songs on the surface seem like simple, upbeat and chanty pop songs, but under the surface there's so much depth to these lyrics. The characters and stories presented are more vivid than ever and manage to capture the feelings of the many better than any record Springsteen has ever done. The title track, arguably one of Springsteen's most recognizable, perfectly encapsulates the ironic, tongue-in-cheek and witty lyricism of the record. But equally, the lyrics present some of the most personal of Springsteen's career, with tracks tackling feelings of isolation and friendship. Bobby Jean is a tearjerker, focusing on the uncertainty of how distance will affect a long-lasting friendship. My Hometown is a beautiful track about growing up surrounded by racial violence and economic depression, and Glory Days, one of my favourite Springsteen songs and my personal highlight on this album, is a tragically comedic track about reminiscing on the past. There are many reasons why it's considered one of the most essential albums of the 80s and was a huge success. It's as perfect as music comes, one of the best albums ever written and one that has become an instant favourite of mine. I'm not exaggerating when I say I have probably listened to this album more than all of Springsteen's other albums combined at this point. It's just incredible. And that is every Bruce Springsteen album ranked in my personal opinion. Despite being in his mid-70s, I'm almost certain that there's plenty more to come from the boss. I hope you've enjoyed this exploration through Bruce Springsteen's discography. Thanks for watching all the way to the end if you've made it this far, and I'll see you next time.